This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, should we make a start? The list of our Quantitative Methods masterclass lectures. And it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Bobby Duffy from Ipsos MORI. Bobby is Managing Director of Ipsos MORI Social Research Institute and Global Director of Ipsos Social Research Institute. He leads a team of around 200 researchers in London, Manchester and Edinburgh. He's been seconded to the Centre of Analysis of Social Exclusion at the LSE and the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. And he's also visiting Senior Research Fellow at King's College. And Bobby's going to talk today on the theme Survey Research and Insight from Ipsos MORI. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, no problem. It's nice to be here. I just get a bit of a gauge of what people's backgrounds are. I looked at Humanities. Is that Humanities supposed to be first year PhD? No?
Do you want to just say briefly what you're working on?
Not working on anything specifically, just public interest.
Okay.
I'm a postdoc here in history.
Okay.
I'm doing masters in social science of health things.
I used to actually do public opinion data analysis in Canada for a think tank. But yeah, social science background.
Okay.
I'm a first year undergrad history mostly at King's.
Business management at King's.
Okay.
I'm doing master in cities at King's.
In cities?
Cities.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm doing English literature at King's.
Wow. What a mix.
Yeah.
What a mix of interesting background. Very good.
I'm a historian.
You're a historian, yeah. Okay, what do you do?
I'm doing an MSc in Geographic Information.
Yes, very good. Person at the back.
Would you say what are you working on?
I'm going to start a PhD in energy law.
Right.
And it sounds smart, but it's going to compare regulations to see how you apply this to research.
Thank you very much.
Goodness, what a variety. That's very interesting. So I'm quite glad that I've structured it as I have, rather than it being about survey research and the kind of pitfalls and good things about political opinion polling, which is maybe what we're known for. It's more, I've done a selection of interesting things, really, from what we found in the last year or so, which I think illustrate different aspects of the use of survey research to understand social problems. So I'm going to cover these things. You have to do a bit about us. I'll keep it short, so you don't really want to know too much about Ipsos, but I'll tell you a little bit about that for context. Then quite a lot on the challenge of trust of understanding of statistics. So statistics and statistical information, we've done some interesting things on that. We've done a particularly interesting thing on perception gaps, and the difference between people's perceptions and the reality of situations, which is broad relevance for social science generally. And then a bit about generational shifts, which has been a big theme for us for the last year. So it's really about the challenges and opportunities of using this sort of data to understand social problems. So very brief introduction, Ipsos Social Research Institute. So it's a big global organisation, Ipsos. We're in 86 different countries. We work for over 300 different central government departments, hundreds more local and municipal bodies. And then a big part of our work is international multilateral organisations, different EC Commission, the EC DGs, OECD, UN agencies, etc. So all those types of things listed there across a range of policy specialisms. And in the UK, we work across all of these types of areas and others too. So this is mostly the social research institute, mostly my division, and more or less anything you can think of as a policy area, we have a team researching it in terms of researchers in our team doing work for particular clients that mirrors most government departments in the UK, and then lots of agencies abroad. And at the centre in some ways is political polls for the media, which is what we're probably best known for in the UK context at least. Ipsos MORI, and MORI is well known for opinion polling. Actually, I mean, it seems a bit of an unfair test given that your different backgrounds, but the proportion of our work that's political polls in the UK, anyone like to guess how much of our work is actually the kind of political polling that you see in the media? 10%? 5, yes. It's small. 0.16% is actually, in terms of the amount of work we do, it's very, very little. It's mostly about evaluating the impact of different government policies and programmes. It's only because the political opinion polling makes it into the media that you get to see much more of that. It's actually a very small part of our work. So I'm going to not talk about the political polling aspect of it, although that's a big part of my job. Talk more about these general trends in people's use, understanding, and how we can understand people's misperceptions around statistics. And it's always good when you're in an academic environment where you can give some good news about this. This is a series of studies that we did with King's for the Royal Statistical Society about trust in statistics and information. So how much trust you have in information provided by the following types of people. The good news is scientists and academics win in terms of people's levels of trust. So scientists by far the most trusted, academics quite close behind. Then you have quite technical professions, accountants and statisticians. So from my perspective, it's good to have relatively high levels of trust in statisticians. Then you have economists and actuaries in terms of people's levels of trust. And then depressingly for me, pollsters. The only reason we put politicians in the list was to make sure we weren't bottom as pollsters, because politicians are not trusted by anyone, but much less trusted than economists and those types of things. So you have to treat what I say with caution, because people generally do. And there's some interesting trends over time. We've been asking those types of trust questions for years and years, and it doesn't actually change hugely most of it. There's a couple of quite interesting ones. Clergymen and priests, this is in the UK context, is probably the only profession that we've asked about for about 20 professions. We've actually seen a significant decline from about 80 to about 65, that sort of level. And at the same time, we've seen this popularisation of science, particularly in the last few years, where the trust in scientists has gone up. So this new age of reason is probably overstating it, but there is definitely these underlying trends in which people are moving away from, the majority of the population are moving away from that view of trust in religion, more towards a scientific outlook. Which is good, because there's some big technical issues that people have to get to grips with these days. And in a UK context, that includes particularly things around, from a political sphere, particularly things around the economy. Such a key political issue, such big technical questions that people have about the economy, and understanding whether people are actually understanding what we're talking about is a key issue for government and media and others. So there's been a lot of discussion about national debt and deficit. Can you tell me what these words mean? How well do you think people will do in understanding the difference between deficit and debt? Did we have economists? I don't remember we had any economists. No. I think people get it, most people understand the difference between deficit and debt. It's actually surprisingly positive. The total debt means the total amount the government owes. Most people, 82% of people get that right. And the difference between what the government spends and the income that it receives each year is the definition of deficit, and most people seem to get that right. So we were actually quite surprised when people knew this, because it is a tricky one. Our Prime Minister got it wrong. David Cameron, he was given a lecture by Andrew Dilnot, who's head of the UK Stats Authority, who actually spoke at this event with us, so he gets a lecture on it. Politicians do it deliberately. They deliberately mix up deficit and debt, depending on what story they want to tell. But they do get rebuked for it by, more often these days, by the UK Statistics Authority, which is an important role for that type of group. But that understanding of the overall definition doesn't mean people understand the concept fully. You have to be careful with those types of questions, just assuming that means that people know what it actually means. So when you try to put it in a sentence, when you ask people to try to put it in a sentence, whether the following is true or false, the national debt will always go down if the deficit is decreasing. Is that true or false? Yes, false. But a big proportion, much bigger proportion of people get that wrong and think that's true. So even though they say they know what debt and deficit mean, actually 28% of people, nearly 3 in 10 people actually get the wrong answer when they try to use it in a sentence. Yes? Again, you have to be careful of understanding getting a better grip on people's true understanding of these quite complex things. And those who got the definitions right in that previous question were no more likely to get that right. So there isn't, you have to be careful with understanding what people's understanding. The other big challenge from a statistician pollster point of view is that basic understanding of numbers is key to this idea of statistical literacy. It's a very important thing, increasingly important thing today that people understand these types of numbers, but it's mixed. People's understanding of numbers is mixed. I won't do this test because you probably, I'm sure you will get this one. What is 50 expressed as a percentage of 200? Most people get that sort of question right. 92% of people will get that it's 25%. So that there's still, nearly 1 in 10 of the population, 1 in 12 of the population who don't get those very simple percentages. This is slightly trickier one in some ways. What is the average of the following 3 numbers, 5, 10, and 15? Again, people do pretty well, but actually only 70% get that right. You've got to bear in mind the statistical literacy limitations of big parts of the public. 16% of people say 5%, lots of others say 3 in 10 people actually don't get that correct. And that's consistent over time, 2010, same sort of finding. But then they get real difficulties with probability. I will ask you this one. If you spin a coin twice, what is the probability of getting 2 heads? What are we saying? 50? 25 and a 50. So it's actually, we've got this probably, got more people actually. Let's see if we've got how we do relative to the population is quite interesting.
There'll be 25 to 250s, half a chance.
Absolutely. So it is actually 25%. But only 26% of the population get that correct. 58% of the population say 50%. We asked the same question actually of MPs. We do a study twice a year of MPs. And guess how many MPs got that right?
25%.
Actually, they do better than the general public. You would expect them to. You would hope they would. But still, only 6 in 10 MPs got it right. So 40% of MPs didn't get those probabilities right. And when you think about how they have to deal with probability and risk all the time in their jobs, not to be able to get these very simple things correct is actually quite important and worrying in many ways. So that's the kind of basic stats literacy, and we've known about all those types of things for a long time. Those types of things hasn't really shifted too much. But then there was also more social psychological biases in how we consider statistics, how we understand stats as a group, and that's actually probably come more to the fore with books like Thinking Fast and Slow, which maybe some of you read, Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner on behavioral economics, even the kind of nudge type studies that's about when you can nudge people into particular outcomes by Thegler and Sunstein in the US, and David Halpern in the UK. There's this personal optimism bias that people have. So we split the sample. This is another interesting thing you can do with survey research is you can do 2 independent samples on the same survey and then slightly tweak the conditions that you would give that you ask the questions under, and then compare them with 2 representative samples. So this one was, what do you think the probability of or chances of yourself being injured or someone in Great Britain being injured or killed in a road accident this year, whether as a road user or pedestrian? So firstly, with the someone in Great Britain, that's the type of probability profile that people come up with. So some people are very pessimistic, they've got a 1 in 2 chance. They must be very scared to go outside all the time. So some people clearly not understanding the question and answering that incorrectly, because I'm sure that's not what they really think. But then it goes down the profile, and quite a lot of people say about 1 in 10,000, quite high numbers, and 23% not knowing, admitting they don't actually know. But the interesting thing from a social psychological point of view is the difference between if you make it personal, where it's you get a very different profile. In particular, people have much greater propensity to say a very low percentage for themselves. So it should be the same on average. If you added up everyone's chances, it should be a similar sort of chance across the different profiles of people. But actually, people are much more optimistic, personally optimistic, that they will not befall the bad thing. So that's kind of a known thing answering these types of questions. The mean probability, when you take the means, it's 4.1%, so it was 1 in 20-ish chance, 1 in 25 chance that someone else will, but 1.6. Anyone know what the real probability is, as far as we can tell from the accident stats? It's a difficult thing to know, so it would be very unusual if someone did know, but the actual probability is probably about 1.2% of some sort of accident, as far as we can work out from the stats. So actually, people's view of their own probability is not that far wrong, but someone else thinks it's very wrong. And this is an interesting one. This comes from a Sunstein experiment that he did in the US. So Sunstein, one of the authors of Nudge, then he moved to President Obama's office and was very key in pushing out behavioral economics in the US. So imagine you have a life-threatening illness, your doctor has told you need an operation to treat it. How likely at all are you to have this operation if your doctor tells you that? Then we split the sample and did half the sample. We're told 90% of people who have the operation are alive for at least 5 years following the operation, and then the other half of the sample, we're told 10% of people who have the operation die within 5 years. So it's exactly the same statistical outcome for people. But as you probably guessed, profile for 90% of people who have the operation are alive. Much more positive, much higher figures for very likely compared to 10% of people dying. So that focus on dying, death, even if it's the same chance, that just because you present it as 10% chance of dying rather than 90% chance of living, affects people's views. It doesn't really make them definitely more against the operation. It kind of pushes them to don't know, so they sort of want more information on it. That seems to be the profile. That kind of fits with the US experiments too. There's a practical implication for that from a more kind of tactical policy point of view, is that from a government perspective, having targets on negatives is not necessarily a very good thing. We saw something very similar in the UK, where there was a lot of focus on targets on waiting lists for hospital treatment, and actually under the previous Labour, actually all that did was remind people that there were waiting lists, and actually it didn't make them feel much more positive about health services. So that focus on negative information, we're naturally predisposed to pick up on negative information, and you don't want to emphasise it too much. But just quickly, does it matter? Do people actually take account of evidence when they're coming to their views? From a politician's point of view, we ask people whether they think politicians take decisions partly on what they think is right, partly on the evidence of what works, or solely on what they think is right, solely on the evidence of what we think works. And people have the view that politicians basically mostly go on what they think is right rather than the evidence, some on a mix, but very few on just on the evidence and what they think is right. And we didn't ask them to judge whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing to do, because people do like the principle based, but we do know actually it's a very similar pattern to how people themselves use evidence. They don't particularly look for representative studies in order to come to views. It's much more about their personal experience, what they know, what their family know, than it is about actually looking at the stats, looking at information across different outcomes. And then a couple of really depressing ones as a statistician about the undervaluing of numbers, and we're not embarrassed about our lack of understanding of numbers. So which of the following things would you feel most embarrassed to admitting to family and friends? Twice as likely, nearly 3 times as likely to be embarrassed if you're not very good at reading and writing, and say you're not very good at numbers. Although it's quite good that people aren't embarrassed about either, so it's good that people will be more likely to seek help on those things. But the depressing one is more this. There's very little pride in doing numbers well. So if you ask, thinking about your child, or if you had a child, which of the following would make you most proud? Only 13% of people picked numbers, making them most proud. Reading and writing, 55% of people picked reading and writing. We forced them to the choice. It might be that they could be proud of both, but that bias within it, and actually it's much more about the reading and writing aspect of it than it is about the numbers aspect of it, which is slightly worrying. I'm not sure that you want those sorts of parents that would be proud about neither. That seems a bit harsh, not very encouraging for your children. If you say neither, the don't know is probably just don't know kids. So, I mean, this is, sorry, Charles.
Just wondering, the sample is for the UK.
Yes, these are UK.
It would be really interesting to see globally.
That's a very good point. We've just done a global study which looks at some of this, actually. We haven't released that data yet, but yes, so we have got that. Yes, it is very interesting. Yeah.
How come for the optimism bias, the base of the sample is much smaller than the rest of the other statistics we gave us?
It's because we split the sample. So we standardly have a 1,000 sample for these kind of UK-based things, 1,000 or 2,000. So we split the sample in half to ask one person, one version of the question, and the other half of the question. So that's 500 samples. In terms of reliability, it doesn't make a huge difference to the aggregate reliability of it when you're just looking at the aggregates. Limits the subgroups you can look at within it, but actually 500 sample pretty reliable if sampled properly. So the reason that's important in some ways is this is Hal Varian, who's chief economist at Google. So he keeps saying that the sexy job in the next 10 years will be statisticians, and I'm not kidding. You can tell by the way he phrases it that no one believes him when he says that, because he has to keep saying it and convince people he's not kidding, but he's right in many ways. This is going to, that data scientist, the ability to deal with data is going to be so key, and we've got a long way to go on that, particularly culturally in the UK. We've got some issues with the emphasis we put on that numerical understanding, statistical understanding. And you can see some of that in the second part. So the second part is about perception gaps, and these are rife. We did this study last year, got lots of attention because the media love people getting things wrong, but some of it is really quite remarkable. I won't ask you to guess this. This is the question that we ask people. We ask people, out of every 100 people in Britain, how many do you think are all of those categories along the bottom? So the actuals are 59% Christian, mostly based on census data, age 65 plus, 16% Black and Asian, 11% unemployed, 8%, which would be labour force survey, I think, Muslim, 5%, single parents, 3%. And we'll ask you to guess the actual, what people thought the actual was, so their perceptions of it. What do you think Christian, what proportion of the population do you think people in the UK think are Christian within the UK? Yeah, very good, 34%. So again, that's a natural thing that you see in other countries. People underestimate the majority population quite a lot in terms of religion and ethnic profile. Age 65 plus. 25, yes, it's up there, and you can see, keep going a bit higher, 36. And you can see why, because that's all of the emphasis on an aging population, demographic time bomb, all of those types of things gives this image to people that actually the older population is much larger than it actually is at this minute. Because we're always talking about the future and how big it's going to be in the future. Black and Asian?
40.
It's up there, 30%. So it's that perception, which is very similar to the immigrant perception, the proportion of immigrant population, which comes in a second. Unemployed.
Is this 21?
Yes, 22%. People think that 22% of the population are unemployed. Again, that emphasis, particularly at the time this was done, which was last year, about this time last year, lots of focus on unemployment. Muslim. Yeah, that's probably the most remarkable one in many ways. People think that 1 in 4 of the population are Muslim in the UK, and so insanely wrong in terms of that perception. Single parents. This is a tough one actually, because we probably didn't define whether it was families or not, so I'll tell you that one. So 28%, and I kind of think that's a bit unfair. Some people may be thinking of families rather than the population, so we let them away with that debate. And then this is a classic favourite one. We've got an extraordinary view of teenage girls. So we asked people, in your opinion, what proportion of girls under the age of 16 get pregnant each year? We underline under 16. And that's the sort of profile that you get. So 5% are less, but 7% 40 plus. So nearly half of the under 16 population getting pregnant each year. Fair enough, 31% say don't know, not admitting a guess, but the guesses are extraordinarily high. And these are, just to be clear, so we often get asked, these weren't the categories that we showed them. We didn't sort of force them into these ones. It was a free text enter, you enter the percentage that you think it is. It wasn't sort of trying to tweak how people respond. So that 31%, gets that 40%, so 40% plus 7%, say 40% plus. You think of a classroom of 50 teenage girls, and you're talking 30 plus, you're talking 12 of them being pregnant each year, which is incredible. So the mean estimate is 15%. Anyone know what the actual is?
2%.
0.6. As far as we can tell, again, it's not an easy thing to measure because it's getting pregnant, not taking to term when we were asking people, but from all the stats that people have, that is about where we are. There's a lot of concern about immigration. This is an interesting case study of misperceptions. 76% of people say that the number of immigrants coming to the UK is too high. And I spent the whole of last year looking at attitudes to immigration in one of the most depressing studies that I've done, just because of such a volume of data that says more or less the same thing over and over again about immigration. But there are some legitimate concerns driven by a number of factors which we could discuss. But just sticking on this misperception aspect of it, as I said, the mean estimate for immigrants, what percentage of the UK population do you think is immigrants, not born in this country, with that kind of definition? 31%. People know the actual. 10 to 15, perfect, yes, 13. So the official figures would be 13. Migration Watch, who's a campaigning group on immigration, who emphasise the importance of immigration, would say, even they would say that legal immigration would only take it up to about 14% overall. So the actual is twice, the actual is half the level of the mean estimate. But the interesting, so we wanted to, that's well known, and we kind of, you see that a lot, but we wanted to try to probe why people thought that. So we took everyone who said 26% or more of the population, so twice what the official actual is, and asked them why they think it is. We told them that according to the last census in 2011, essentially the UK population born in other countries is actually 13%. Why do you think the percentage is much higher? We just asked them why they thought it was. And any idea what the top answers are from the media? The media. Yes. No, in fact. I mean, that's a very firm hypothesis that the media has an impact on these things, but it wasn't the reason that people give themselves.
I think people are more easy to notice something unusual.
Yes.
And then they keep being impressed by this kind of immigration.
Yeah, that is true. The visible nature of immigrant populations has a big impact on people overestimating it. That's true, but it's not the reason that people, the top reason for people think.
The recent cuts and the crisis is associated maybe with immigrants or the lack of job and the increase of unemployment?
Yeah, that's true. That's true too, in the sense that people do think that. They do think that, but they didn't give that as the reason why they think the percentage is much higher. I'll tell you why. They don't believe it. So illegal immigration, as you say, but just so they're not counted, or I just still think immigration is much higher, that you're just lying to top answers by some distance. So the lack of trust in statistics around immigration and lots of other things is very strong in people that have that level of overestimation at least. Next is actually what I see in my local area, so that perception of, actually because it tends to be that minorities are visible, immigrant minorities are visible, or at least identifiable. It's what you see, and what you see when you visit towns and cities. And it's only, I like these people, these are my best, these are my favourite people. I was just guessing, so they're the most honest group in the whole of the survey. I was just guessing, that's nice. And then it's only then that people admit that it's TV and newspapers. There's lots of other work that would show that it's more important than that. Important to note though that we're not alone. This isn't just Britain that's obsessed by this or gets this wrong. So we've got the actual percentage of foreign born, and on the bottom, estimated percentage of foreign born. And on the top, that's a 45-degree angle or a split, even split. So you would expect if everyone got perfect knowledge, they would all be along that line. What you actually find is every single country is above the line. So every single country overestimates the proportion of foreign-born population. So it's kind of it's innate in people to make that sort of overestimation of this. And we are one of the worst, but we're not necessarily the worst. France, Portugal, US, lots of other countries massively overestimate the proportion of immigrants in their population relative to the actual level. Similar things, this is an interesting one just because it shows decay in people's views, how long it takes for people's views to shift. Violent crime is rising, whether we ask people just whether that's true or false among a series of other statements, and it's been falling quite consistently in the UK for quite a number of years. In 2013, 51% of people thought that violent crime was rising, so that's in the latest one. So it's actually, that seems quite bad. Half the people think violent crime is rising when actually it's falling. Certainly at the time of this survey it was falling, but when you compare that with 2005, which is probably a time of greater fall in violent crime, it was actually 83% of people thought that violent crime was rising, even though, again, it was falling probably at a quicker rate in those days. And that is an indication of how long it takes for people's perceptions to shift. You need to be in these sorts of declines for a long time before you actually get a shift in people's views. So 51% is actually a bit of a step forward in terms of people's views of crime. And the answer lots on public spending, people's understanding of where the government spends money. So I won't go into those in too much detail, but the pensions versus job seekers allowance, which is the main the main working age benefit for people out of work. We ask people, what do you think the UK government spends more on, job seekers allowance or state pensions? And this is a sort of pattern that you get. 3 in 10 people think the government spends more on job seekers allowance than it does on pensions, state pensions. 47% say more on pensions, 11% say both the same. So 4 in 10 think JSA costs about the same or more than pensions. Anyone know the relative spending on those things?
1% versus 99%.
It's very unbalanced. So it's sort of 5% 70 that's in billions. So 5 billion versus 74 billion. So massive misrepresentation, misunderstanding of what we spend on different things, which again, really important when you get into debates about cuts, priorities, all of those types of things. Just not a perception that pensions, that costs a lot, but a big focus on working age benefits, which is affecting how people react to those things. So 15 times more on pensions. And then probably the thing that people get most wrong in absolute terms is out of every £100 spent on welfare budget, what is claimed fraudulently, i.e. people dishonestly claim benefits, more benefits than they're entitled to. So the mean estimate is £24 in every £100 is claimed fraudulently. Anyone know the actual one? Yeah, you get your hang of this. Going low is definitely the way to go. It's actually 70 pence, according to government statistics. And they've got good reason, they've been focusing on fraud, so they've been trying to find fraud, so 70 pence is probably not a bad figure. But again, you need to probe a bit deeper to understand what's going on in people's views here. So we ask people, when you think answering the last question, which of the following activities were you thinking of as fraud? So it's quite an undefined term, fraud. And some of them are pretty straightforward, providing false information, faking disabilities, not reporting a change in circumstances, working cash in hand. Some of them a little bit middling on whether these are fraud. People on unemployment benefits not trying to find work, that really it wouldn't be counted as fraud, but it may be viewed as fraudulent. People from abroad, immigrants claiming benefits, we should be more precise in our definition of that, because that's clearly not fraud, because it is allowed depending on what group you're in. But then these are clearly not fraud, so just that sense that people haven't paid taxes and national insurance, that's still in some senses seen as fraudulent. You haven't paid in, you haven't contributed to the system, so you're counting that as fraud. People having more children so that they're entitled to more benefits, again, a fair chunk of people answering that. So if you take those two together, 45% of people give some sort of reason for fraud that actually has nothing to do with fraud. It's just that sense of people claiming too many benefits. That's what people are getting across to us when they're saying £24 and everyone £100 is claimed fraudulent. It's not simply about fraud itself, it's about concern about the issues. So why do these gaps exist? It kind of comes, these are the four key themes, I think, and that's part of it, which I'll come back to. There's measurement and definitional problems, imprecision in the questions, but we're also talking about different things. You have to be careful that when we talk about fraud, what people themselves are talking about too, when you're looking at these misperceptions. There's all sorts of cognitive errors, statistical literacy ones, simple mathematical ones, and then social psychology ones, availability heuristics, people just grabbing information that's in their heads that may fit a bit. That focus on negative information is something we'll do. Framing and anchoring are important. And we can see examples of that a bit later. And people take time to notice. There is this element of decay there. The media and political rhetoric is, as people were saying earlier, is very important in this. The issue is that people don't really remember facts about stuff. They remember vivid stories. So even if fraud, benefit fraud, immigration, immigrants using benefits, all of those types of things may be vanishingly rare, but if you can come up with an anecdote around them, that's the thing that people will remember. So that's why it's really important. The media coverage is not so much about the accuracy of statistics, although UK Statistics Authority needs to do that with government. It's much more about controlling that vivid story that may be true, but it's vanishingly rare and non-representative of things. And then finally, the most important thing, I'd say, is to understand that there is something called emotional innumeracy, which you may have come across in other spheres. So the reason that people are so involved in this is it reflects their concerns. So they're worried about benefit fraud or benefit misuse. They're worried about immigration, so they give a high estimate. It's called it's motivated reasoning. People, when they're answering those types of questions, have accuracy goals. So they want to get the right answer when you ask them those types of questions. But they also have directional goals. So they want to send you a message about what they're worried about. So it's not as simple as saying people are worried because they've got such a wrong view of immigration or such a wrong view of benefit fraud. It's partly their wrong view of benefit fraud is because they're worried, for example. So we need to be careful of not saying that people are just stupid. You educate them, and then they will have more reasonable views about these types of things. So it's not quite as straightforward as that. So the implications of that is don't expect massive impact from myth-busting or educational efforts. People do have rational ignorance on this. It's not, it's an extent to which actually putting the effort into finding out about these things is still not going to change their minds. But don't give up on them either. There is something very wrong about people having that sort of incorrect understanding of issues. But narrative and emotional appeal to making these sorts of cases is central. That's what people remember, that's what affects them much more than the rational, statistical, economic arguments of it. And then the interesting things potentially for the future in terms of whether you can do mass deliberation on these things. We do lots of deliberative events where we get people in a room for a day or two, you go through the issues, give them evidence, discuss with them, allow them to discuss themselves, and you can see people's views shifting. But how you do that on a national scale is really limited right now. But technology may give us more opportunities for that. Mark Easton from the BBC was at this event, and he's very keen on whether the BBC can play a bigger role in bringing those sorts of mass deliberations together. But there's always limitations to those. So that's part two. doing? Not too bad on time.
Yeah.
Part 3. Part 3 is generations, which is something very close to my heart because I spent a lot of time on this last year. And this is much more about using the data. That's a lot about the pitfalls, how you've got to be careful in your interpretation. This is about how using quite simple techniques gives us a different sort of insight into what's going on. So why did we do generational analysis? This is looking at different generations as cohorts rather than different age groups. And I think there's probably been limited work on generational differences in attitudes and values in the UK. Complex stuff. Complex presentations, split into small cohorts, difficult to see the different patterns. It's been not very good in the UK. In the US, great stuff by Pew, much more intuitive. We didn't actually spot it before we started ours. We ended up in almost exactly the same place. We would have got there quicker if we looked at what Pew were doing. So they've got great things. We've got to understand generational differences in the US. Pew have got a really strong theme on that. The second reason is our generational balance is changing in the UK quite fundamentally and in other countries. Right now we've got 4 roughly equally sized but quite different generations culturally and values-based. We've got pre-war generation, baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y. Got the definition of it. So it's basically...
So what's the difference between Gen X and Gen Y?
Okay. Pre-war generation, everyone born 1945 and before. Baby boomers, 45 to 65. Generation X, 66 to 1979 in our version of it. And then Generation Y is everyone born 1980 to 2000, in our definition. And we've taken that from David Williams's book, The Pinch, on generational difference, and it actually works quite well. So Generation X, this is purely about when you were born. There's no other data used to define the generation, purely on when you were born. And I think the reason that we miss this sometimes is, again, we focus on our aging population rather than actually we've got a very different older population. The pre-war generation is very different from the baby boomer generation. Similarly, Gen X and Gen Y are quite different, as I'll show you here. The third reason is that a better future no longer seems so certain for people. And that's really important. If you haven't got hope for the future, that there's been an assumption that things will keep getting better. Particularly in the UK context, that has been the case, that you've got a natural assumption of a better future. In the US, that's starting to wane maybe a bit earlier than us. So we asked for Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, I think, to what extent do you feel your generation will have had better or worse life than your parents' generation? Will it be about the same? That doesn't look too bad, the 61% versus 61% saying better overall, 18% saying worse. But it's the difference between generations that's important. So only 42, it goes up and down, as you might expect, much more positive. So you've got 8 and 10 of the pre-war generation saying better, but only 42%, half the level of Generation Y, saying that they're have a better time than previous generations. So that issue, the issue is basically things are looking worse for generations, and that has all sorts of implications, not just for the generations themselves, but for their parents' generations as well. So, as I say, David Williams wrote a book called The Pinch, how the baby boomers took their children's future and why they should give it back, which is a really good book, actually. It was a bit light on data, so we added this through analysing a number of different surveys using something called simulated cohorts or synthetic cohorts. So it's cross-sectional survey, so it's not following the same individuals through the studies, it's just saying everyone who's born in this year in this study, we'll look at them there, then we just move on a year, so that each of the groups, as I'll show you, are a year older, each year the study moves on. So we use British Social Attitude Survey, European Social Survey, our own data and much more. The important thing is, nowadays we have long survey series that go back to the early 1980s, and that's when you can start to unpick some of these things. Just before I actually show you data, you may know this already, but I'll just run through how do attitudes and values change. When you're looking at an overall population, there's only really 3 potential types of change. You have a period effect, which is where all attitudes of all cohorts kind of change in the same way. Age groups and generations, doesn't matter, they change in a similar fashion over a similar period of time. Something happens, it's an event-driven, general cultural change. Life cycle effects, people's views just shift as they age and often around key life events. So having children, going into work, all of those types of things tend to shift people's attitudes in predictable ways. So you've got life cycle effects too. And then you've got cohort effects, which is independent of those things. It's a cohort has a different view, and these stay different over time. It's to do with the context you grew up in. People will have a very different view of technology, depending on when they grew up in. And that kind of sticks with the majority of those populations. You can't really completely unpick that mathematically. It's impossible because it's all self-defined. It's all one system. But you can get an idea very simply, actually, through a very simple graphical technique. So when we started with views of welfare, this is an overall pattern. It's interesting in itself. The government should spend more money on welfare benefits, or probably leads to higher taxes. Agreement with that in the UK is halved from 1987 to 2011. So massive movement against spending more money on welfare benefits for the poor, if it leads to higher taxes. So, and similarly, a doubling of disagreement with that. So big shift against spending more on welfare in the UK context. But it's how that changes within generations and cohorts that's key. That is key in this. So this is what the charts I'm then going to show you. We'll split it into pre-war, so it's the same colours throughout. Pre-war is dark blue. So this is following people of the same age group throughout independent surveys. So in 1987, they would be by the time we get to 2011, they would be that number of years older. So we'd just be looking at that group that is that number of years older, just following them through as they go. So younger at this end, older at that end, all those people born pre-1945. You can see it kind of goes down over time. It goes down over time in the way that we saw with the overall findings. Then you've got baby boomers, who very similar pattern of change, but a degree lower in terms of agreement that the government should spend more on welfare. And you've got Generation X, similar sort of pattern. So you're seeing the same sort of period effect of something is changing in the culture, but it starts again lower. Less interest in welfare, less interest in redistribution. Then Generation Y, similar to Generation X, but again even slightly lower in some ways. So there's three things from this. There's climate support across the board, so there's period effects, something is changing in our view of welfare. The generations are generally different and stay different, so you're kind of set with an attitude towards welfare from when you were younger, so it kind of stays that way throughout. And then younger age groups are less open to further redistribution, which was probably the biggest surprising thing with this, particularly given the young people having a tough time. Right, lots of young people having a tough time right now, but actually that interest in further redistribution is lower among that age group rather than higher. And that's despite this pattern in how people feel about their income, using the same sort of breakdown. You've got pre-war, this is a portion of people who say, self-report that they're on a low income. They're saying themselves that they're on a low income. They're pretty flat across the period. So same sort of proportion of pre-war generation think they're on a low income. But bear in mind, they are now 27 years older at that end than they are at that end. So at this end, about 5 or 6% of them were retired. At that end, nearly 90% of them were retired. So they've had a massive shift in their life stage. They've massively moved into retirement, but still they don't feel that much poorer, which is interesting. And it kind of fits with ONS figures that show retirement income has gone up hugely in the last few years. Pensioners are much better supported than they were at the beginning of that line. So that's a good thing in many ways. Baby boomers hardly ever felt that poor. Most of them didn't feel that poor. But kind of, you can see a little bit of a life cycle effect, but they've always been one of the richer feeling groups. Baby boomers have done quite well, as David Bullock would say. Generation X, really interesting. That's my generation. So we had a terrible time to start with. Things started to go well. There was a terrible recession, 90s, early 90s here, then wage deflation, and then we started to feel poor again. Then we've had a brilliant time since. We've kind of accelerated away in terms of our level of income, which is good. So we looked really shaky at the beginning of our careers. Actually, has come okay. The worrying one is Generation Y. We've extended this line a bit now, and it's still up there. So the poorest generation is our youngest generation, poorest feeling generation is our youngest generation, and they still feel poor now, which is a very unusual situation. It tends to be the older generations feeling poorer, younger generations only at the very start and then improving. So the longer that goes on, the younger generation feeling poorest could have serious implications for how people engage, how people feel about society generally. I'll skip that one, it's the same sort of idea. And then I'll just go interesting. Generation Y are really interesting as a group because they've got that less interest in redistribution, feel poor, more likely to feel poor than other generations, but they're also quite harsh on welfare benefits, from whether they're deserved or not. They're much closer to the pre-war generation in terms of their outlook on welfare benefits, that you shouldn't really deserve welfare benefits, you've got to earn them, and you've got to look after yourself. So if welfare benefits weren't so generous, people would learn to stand on their own 2 feet. Quite often, Generation Y were closer to the pre-war generation than younger generations, other younger generations on that. So there's that sense of personal responsibility pretty strong among that Generation Y group, which may be a bit counter to the idea that they've got lots of entitlement. Actually, that's not the case. There's quite a strong sense of individualism and personal responsibility. You can see that in things like who's going to pay for your care needs of elderly people. Most of the other generations pretty much want the government to do it. Whenever you ask a question about whether I should pay, whether the government should, people are going to choose the government because it's not a direct cost. But Generation Y is the one that stands out as a bit different. We've only got one data point at the end there, so it's quite a smaller sample on this one, but closer together, more likely to say mainly a person, less likely to say mainly the government, much more of a sense of personal responsibility for it. Whether that's an active choice of fatalism because they just know they're going to have to pay for themselves is an open question. But they're not a selfish generation. When you ask them what do you think should be the greatest priority for extra spending, if there is any extra spending, it's actually old age pensions, the blue one, old age pensions, that comes second with them, ahead of unemployment benefits, which comes very low, ahead of disability benefits. It's only child benefits that come higher. So it's not just pure self-interest that when you ask Gen Y about things, they're not just looking after themselves, they are thinking of old age pensions too. But there is self-interest across the generations. This is quite interesting for older people among us. Which of these do you think should be the highest or second highest priority for extra spending? Percentages would say old age pensions. You can kind of see pre-war generation quite old throughout this period, so pretty focused on let's spend more on old age pensions. Baby boomers starting much lower, now almost exactly the same as pre-war generation. You can see kind of the selfish gene kicking in there. Similar sort of thing, even my generation, Generation X, started to think pensions, that's what we need to do, that gap is closing, not quite so much. And obviously Gen Y significantly lower on that, and not really going up too much, too far away from us to worry about too much. But this is probably the starkest, the final bit on welfare is probably the starkest illustration of different perspectives and why we need to be really, why this generational analysis is really important. How much do you agree or disagree? The creation of the welfare state is one of Britain's proudest achievements. Pre-war, since 2000, incredibly flat and very proud of the welfare state. 70% of people in that generation say it's one of our proudest achievements. Baby boomers, very flat again. This is a set value, a set view among that cohort. A bit lower than 60%. Then a big gap. Generation X, 40%, only 40% of us as a group saying that it's one of our proudest achievements, and then the big gap again, particularly recently, under 30% of Generation Y saying the same sort of thing. So it's kind of, you've got to understand where people are in this. This isn't an active rejection of welfare, it's just Generation Y, younger generations, just not that close to the setup, the history of the welfare state, don't really understand it in the way that other groups do. Very important to have that in mind when you're discussing the future of welfare with them. Final bit is just on party politics and immigration. Come on to the end. Who still believes in party politics? This is the support for party politics declining over time in the UK. It was 50% when people say that they feel close to one particular party. Now it's about 40-ish%, so it's gone down about 10 percentage points since 1983. So the only surprise about that for me is it's not steeper in the way that people talk about the decline of party politics. And the reason, though, is completely because of the generational pattern. This is something that hadn't really been picked up on too much before we did this analysis. The reason is because generations is completely flat. You're kind of born into a connection to whether you're going to be connecting to a political party or not, and that just stays pretty flat over time. There's a bit of a life cycle effect around elections, but actually it's very flat. So the reason it's going down is because older people are dying, younger people are being replaced, generational replacement is called, by young people with lower levels. So two things, it's going to be slow, but it's going to be inevitable that party politics is in real trouble in the UK. Very hard to fight those types of, that type of difference between top and bottom, between those generations, but it's all going to be slow. It's not going to be a massive jump unless something major happens. And is that a British disease? This is from the European Social Survey, same sort of question, same sort of gap between the top and the bottom, oldest and youngest. And the depressing thing is we've got the widest in the UK, but the widest dispersal between the top and the bottom. We've got a reasonably highly connected to political parties, older group, and a very unconnected younger group. So it's a common sort of pattern across Europe, but we're the worst at it, which is a real challenge. So if you look at Germany, very similar pattern, same sort of grouping, pre-war, baby boomer, Gen X, Gen Y, but closer together, not that same sort of sense of dispersal between them. Sweden is very different. Sweden's always very Swattish on these things. They're always very good at connection and engagement, very close together between the different generations. And then, the Irish brought everyone together by rejecting all parties. So they were so bad in 2010, around that sort of time, that everyone just said they're rubbish. And it did bring them together, but probably not in the way that you would want a political party. I'll skip, unless people are really interested in the voting pattern, I'll skip over that quite fast, but it just sort of shows that the generations have come together. The Tory vote was very generational for a long, long time. It looked like that party was going to die, and you look at it there, actually that shifted. And actually there's not much generational difference between the two. Labour, on the other hand, was incredibly generationally consistent. So that sort of one nation rhetoric that you hear now of Labour was actually true on a generational basis. But since then, it's spread a reasonable amount. We have got more younger people supporting Labour, fewer older people supporting Labour. But still, Labour has clearly, so Generation Y has increased for both Tories and Labour in terms of their levels of support, but Labour still has a clear lead over Tories with the youngest age group. That has been reported. All of that stuff together we released with Joseph Rowntree and Demos and a few others, and it was reported appallingly in the newspapers as Generation Y, truly Thatcher's children. Not really what it says. Conservatives winning over Ipsos Group for Rod Liddell outdid himself with his lecherous, godless and young. Just about 3 of those 4 things are wrong. Not greedy, not lecherous, not godless, but they are young. Maybe Dave's #1 fans is pushing it as well. So much more complex in terms of Generation Y's relationship with politics and welfare than those types of things would imply. Just finish on the immigration one, because it's just something we've been doing a lot on. Something that you may not pick up on from the discussion of immigration is that the generational patterns are becoming more important in understanding people's concerns. This is a question that we've asked every month since the 1970s about what's the most important issue facing Britain. It's just taken the race relations, immigration, immigrants category from 1996, and then splitting it by the same generational groups. And you can see this is more or less when immigrant numbers went up significantly, 1999, 2000. And it took people a while to notice that immigrant numbers had gone up, and they weren't worried before that at all. Very, very little worry about immigration before. Numbers went up, and people started to worry. But all generations were quite close together in that. The older generation a bit more, the younger generation a bit less, but not a massive difference. But since then, we've seen this splitting, and actually it's split a bit more in the 2013 figures. So we've got this widening between the generations, and immigration concern is becoming much more of a generational issue than it is a class issue. This is the class pattern, social class pattern, just A being the top social class, B being next, C1 all the way down to E, which is unemployed people. And there was, around there, a real dispersal between different social classes and their concern about immigration. It was effectively the skilled manual classes that got really worried because they had pressure on their jobs. And the A classes, the elites, just weren't bothered about it too much. But since then, it's kind of come together. And this, at the far end of the thing, it's much less a class issue, much more a generational issue. You can kind of see that from these final two slides. This is from the European Social Survey. I just presented this in Berlin at the embassy there last week, and it's a very interesting contrast between Britain and Germany. So looking at Britain first, generational differences in whether immigration is good for the economy specifically. It's net good, so pre-war generation, I think more people saying it's negative than positive for the economy. So you've got that line sort of bumping along at the bottom there, pretty consistent. But the interesting pattern in the UK is the movement of baby boomers. They started off actually the most positive about the economic impact of immigration, and now have ended up the most negative as Generation X and Generation Y gone in the other direction on this. So we've got this generational split now between older groups thinking it's bad news for the economy, and younger people actually thinking it's not so bad for the economy. So big positive movements. Big contrast with Germany. That's the same thing in Germany. So it started, if you look at 2004, the actual overall views and the kind of generational difference, not that different from the UK. But since then, the debate, the way that it's been talked about in Germany about immigration and the need for immigration, has brought two things, everyone up and everyone together on the need for immigration for the economy, which is interesting in a UK context. It does show people's views can be shifted on these types of things. If there's a need for it, economic need for it, and consistent messaging on it. That's unreleased though. So generationally, I mean, the conclusions from the generation bit is that there's increasing power in the data, which is because we've been doing this for a long time now. We've got all this long-term trend that we can start to look at. So and we've got new analysis approaches and output approaches that make this very, very easy. Looking back tells us a lot. It seems quite counterintuitive that actually to understand the future and to be able to predict what types of changes we're going to see, understanding how the reason for the change in the past is very important. And we need to be careful about our assumptions when we're young. There's a lot of wrong conversations going on about them. We still don't fully understand what is the position of younger groups on lots of these important political things. So overall, understanding public opinion is vital, but difficult on lots of these things. Not everything is as it might appear for the reasons that we've seen. You need to ask what are opinions based on? Being aware of knowledge, just in terms of absolute knowledge levels, and but also these inbuilt biases that we have. And someone was saying today, actually, at another event I was at, that we should never overestimate the public's knowledge or underestimate their intelligence. And I think that's very apt in some ways. This is not about people being stupid. It is about lack of awareness of some of the issues, and there's reasons for that. But beyond that, you have to ask why people are wrong. It's not because of stupidity or a lack of interest even sometimes. It's because they're trying to send a message or a signal about what they're concerned about. So you have to interpret them not as a one-direction thing. People are communicating through these types of opinions as well as trying to reflect reality. And then finally on the generational thing, what's driving the change? There's more going on underneath these shifts in public opinion, and understanding that will help us predict the future better. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's really fascinating stuff. I've got time to take one or two questions. Yeah, please.
Just wondered whether this information was available online.
Yes. Yeah, all generation one will be on that. All the other stuff will be on our website.
Okay, and is this being podcast?
Yes, yes.
We'll receive a link that one says you can have.
Yes.
I have a question on the theoretical level. Pierre Bourdieu in the 70s published a quite provocative article called Public Opinion Doesn't Exist. He put emphasis on different problems, such as the fact that pollsters do not give up the numbers of people who do not answer at all, or how the phrasing of the questions might influence the answer, and how do you respond to that kind of criticism?
Yeah, there's lots of those types of criticism. The not giving up data at all, that doesn't happen so much. The whole point about surveys are they're context specific, so absolutely you need to interpret the results of the survey knowing how the question was asked and the context in which the question was asked. And actually what's very interesting about the big focus on social psychology and behavioural economics is the parallel literature in survey methods is much more developed and was developed much earlier than that kind of social psychology, because we had to. So in the 50s and 60s, there was so much work done on the types of experimentation of changing contexts and changing how you set up questions that you see now that the Behavioural Insight team will be doing at number 10. So Behavioural Insight team, nudge unit, doing lots of the types of things that actually all the methodologists, survey methodologists were looking at much earlier, because we always knew that framing, anchoring, all of those types of things, very, very important to how people respond, because that was our day-to-day, that's our day-to-day job, is seeing that we can influence opinion, stated opinion on these types of things, just by changing quite small things in the data. There's quite a lot of examples that you can get from the website in those studies where we did some of that, where we played around with how you present the question to people to see, to assess the extent to which you can change views. So even on that immigration one, you can lower people's estimate of the proportion of immigrants in the country just by giving them a series of categories that start quite low and don't go up too high, so people will select for that. So we absolutely, but the answer to that, the answer to those criticisms or queries is always just to study the way the question's been asked and look further than just the initial results that you see. And in that case, I would say that there's still huge value from it, and you can still get some ideas of what people really think, as long as you interpret it sensibly.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of points. With media misconceptions, is there any contractual obligations that you have as an organisation to make sure that the media actually represents the results correctly? And my other sort of comment was, what's the effect of some of the results of the polls, of public opinion polls, actually having an influence within themselves of public opinions, or guiding public opinion, like a bandwagon sort of effect? And just general point about the context. Some of the results can be. I'm curious to know how you deal with sort of how some of the results of the polls can be quite simplified, maybe ignoring complexity within some of the results. For example, the first slide showed about scientists, most trusted academics. Sometimes with scientists are in policy and certainly pharmaceutical companies, there's a lot of complex things. So just sort of your comments on some of those things.
Okay, so if I remember Lewis there, so the contractual. Yes, it's if with our media partner clients, so ours is the Evening Standard for our political polling, then we do have a contractual thing with them, which is that they have to check their stuff with us. For stuff that we're doing for other clients, we have a process, internal process, that's called polls for publication, where it has to be reviewed by us when they're producing articles on it based on the data. And that goes through senior people like me within the team before that goes out as a press release or as a piece. Once it gets out there as a press release and as an article that is written and then picked up elsewhere, very, very difficult to control that. We've got no contractual control over those types of things. So the way that we deal with that is if there is misrepresentation of it, actually get in touch with the media outlet that does that misrepresentation and try to get them to change it and correct it, and which they often do. Trouble is post-event, and people have kind of moved on, and those retractions, corrections are very difficult to say that they have a huge amount of impact. I still think it's really important, and I think more than us, we're quite small in the scheme of things, more that the UK Statistics Authority approach to picking people up on the misuse of statistics more generally is really important, not because anyone in the public will ever remember that that's the case. It's more a case of a deterrent effect on not doing it again. If you are someone who keeps getting picked up on these types of things, it's annoying for IDS in Dublin Smith to just keep getting picked up on these types of things. So it's the deterrent effect of organisations like Stats Authority or Full Fact or people like that. I think it's more important than the correction effect, I would imagine. Second one was
about the actual opinion polls, creating opinions within themselves.
Yeah, I don't know yet. Actually, it's a fascinating thing in terms of how the transmission of views through the media, because there has to be a media filter on that, and people don't actually pore over polls themselves so much. So it's kind of understanding the media impact on opinion, and then within that, public opinion polls, media impact on opinion. Really, really difficult. I mean, it is an area that I've done a fair amount on in the past in terms of the impact of newspaper readership on people's opinion. It's so difficult to unpick cause and effect. Quite impossible to unpick cause and effect, even if you can show association of change, which we have done in some of our studies. You can show that, say, Express readers concerned about immigration followed a spike in immigration stories in the Express. Even that aspect of it, even if we've got like great longitudinal data that shows that type of change, cause and effect is impossible to completely improve because it could have attracted readers of a particular type because they were covering that type of story. It's that selection aspect of media consumption makes it really difficult to unpick. But my personal view, there's so much evidence from regression analysis and that type of longitudinal analysis that I'm sure it does have an effect. I'm sure that media discussion has an effect on opinion. I'm sure that the media use opinion polls in particular ways that will affect it. Impossible to unpick and put a value or a determinant on that, I would say. And then the academics and... Yes. No, it's fascinating. Again,
generally the complex nature of...
Yeah, absolutely. So each of those sort of studies, those sort of simple studies, that we've done more detailed studies on each of them. So we've asked, and other people have asked questions that split scientists into scientists for pharmaceutical, into scientists for government, academics for etc. And you can see there are very big differences in people's views of people in particular contexts. So doctors always come top of people's levels of trust. The doctors in the health service say, one of the conclusions was always put a doctor, if you're making a bad policy announcement, get a doctor to do it for you because you've got a higher level of trust. But actually, that's not the point, it's the context in which you trust a doctor because you mostly leave them in a place where you should be trusting them and they've got no incentive to lie to you in those types of circumstances. So absolutely, there's a lot of complexity in those such things, and we do look at and unpick that in particular studies, but we also do this overview thing. And I still think there's value in these overview questions because, again, it's a similar point on the immigration is, if you've got some understanding of what people's mental image is when they're answering that, then I think you can ascribe some value to it. So immigration is a classic example of that, where so much is contained within the word immigrants that people have different things in mind depending on the different questions that you're asking. If you ask about too many immigrants on this or that, we know that people massively overstate in their minds the proportion of asylum seekers. So their first perception of immigrants, when you say 30%, 32% of people are thinking of asylum seekers when you talk about immigrants and not about economic migrants, etc. And it's a similar sort of thing with these other categories. Is as long as you've got an understanding of what is likely to be in people's minds when they're answering those types of questions, I still think they've got value of the relative difference between the different groups and then how those trends change over time. So clergy and religious leaders, people will have different views on what different mental images come to mind when people are answering that type of question, but it's the trend over time that still tells you something valuable.
sorry, just one more sort of. I guess the argument against that would be, it's if you're looking to try to solve the issue or try to improve a specific issue, having a sort of a generalised view of that doesn't really tell us much. So, for example, if we get a perception that there's a lot of immigration in the country, what may be more helpful is a policy that would, or something that would tell us actually what the exact problem is, which may lead to, say, integration, maybe the actual solution to it, not rather than stopping integration, or it can lead to sort of a generalised view can maybe lead to a different policy or different solution then maybe actually what is the real.
Absolutely. No, I agree. So the immigration, the report that we did last year is 250 pages of all of the student data, but looking at it in much more detail than we can show in a presentation like that. So that type of analysis, we do try to unpick exactly what is driving people's use, and then what you might be able to do as a result of that. So it's not this kind of high-level stuff. I agree. We need to delve down deeper into perceptions, and then there are things that you can do, things you can look at to give you a better handle on what you can do. So immigration, as an example, we framed with IPPR, we framed two different treatments of policy for immigration. One was about cost benefits, so what do immigrants bring versus what do they take, and one was about fairness, which is much more about what do they contribute, and is it fair that people should be given a chance if they come here, play by the rules, pay taxes, those types of things. And the fairness argument works much better with people. So it's that sense of contribution much more powerful than actually the cost benefit thing. And you can kind of see that playing out in real policy responses. That is David Miliband's position. And you can see the UKIP position, which very much emphasises these economic benefits are not enough to justify immigration. So you can see actually that type of understanding of public opinion in a bit more depth is shaping both of those types of policy positions.
Thanks very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. That's perfect for this series. So let's thank